morning. Glad you're here this morning at Catalyst. Earlier this year, one of our own, Jasia Nakamoto, she went to a discipleship training school with YWAM, Youth with a Mission. And so she was gone 5-6 months. They do like about 3 months of training, and then they go usually on the field with a team to 2 locations, overseas, or a lot of times it's overseas, or it could be local. And so since she went, I know there was some awesome and challenging and growing experiences she had on her DTS. So ever since she came back, I've been wanting to have an opportunity for her to share with us, for us to hear her adventures with the Lord and what all that the Lord did. So she's going to be sharing today about her DTS experience. So let's give a hand. Welcome to Jasia Nakamoto.
Thank you, Pastor Barry and church family. I really couldn't have done it without you guys. Thank you for all your support. So I went on to discipleship training school, and so I went on Youth with a Mission at the Honolulu base. You can go to the next slide. And so I did spend 3 months training, and so I had times of lecture phase, so I was learning from other speakers. We had yard work, work duties that I had to do, and we did a lot of homeless ministry. The picture on the left, his name is Dan Bauman. He was the speaker, and first week of lectures, the speaker that comes in is the guy who's talking about being persecuted and thrown into jail in Iran. And the one thing that really stood out to me about what he said is that I'd rather live my life taking one step forward towards God than taking one step back. And that you're never 100% sure all the time if you hear from the Lord, but that's because there's doubt and there's choice that you can have in having faith into following him. And so it's better to live a life trusting the Lord and living your life surrendered to him than living your life in regret of what you could have done to follow him. And so that's kind of how I wanted to, from there on, go out with my DTS. So next slide, please. And so we did go to a homeless camp on the west side of the island, and I got to share my testimony and preach the gospel there. You can go to the next slide. And this is our team, our DTS group, and on my back is a little girl, and she's also homeless, and so I did a lot of children's ministry, a lot of skits. Next slide. And then was my outreach phase. So the first location I went to was the Philippines. And so we did a lot of evangelism at universities and in public high schools, which was really interesting because in America, we don't really are allowed to share your faith and give the gospel inside the school in the classroom, but we were able to come in and be welcomed in. Okay, next slide. And then we went to a bunch of different churches. Churches there are an all-day event. And I did a lot of teaching, a lot of sermon giving. I got to pour into a lot of small groups of women, and it was really amazing. Okay, next slide. And so I gave a sermon in Cervantes in the Philippines. And so in that village, so I went to the countryside, I had to use a squatty potty. I had to sleep on the floor. And so here I am, it's 110 degrees, and I'm sharing about how the Lord has really taken away my shame because of Jesus, and that he's given me a new identity because of Christ, and that we don't live in shame no more, but now we're given honor because of what he's done for us. And so, next slide, please. And so, I had to cross that sort of rickety bridge. 7 people died on that bridge before, so, and I showered in that river over there. And so, but it was a huge blessing because I got to pour into kids, and I got to go to places that I never thought I would get to experience, and I get to tell them about Jesus. And they live such simple and loving lives just following the Lord that it actually really inspired me too. So next slide. And so I did a lot of children's ministry. We went to the houses of the poor and the sick, and so we went to sometimes elderly people. Their arms or their backs were disaligned, or they were suffering from like cancer or liver disease, so we got to pray for them. And actually, praise the Lord, but 2 little kids with fevers that didn't have any medicine were healed the next day. They were bedridden, and then God healed them. And so I really thank the Lord. And then on the bottom is our host family. He is amazing. He took the time to just host us as missionaries and know nothing about us. And so next slide, please. And so then I went to Japan, and this is my host family in Japan is in the front. And then we were staying at the church there. So then next slide, please. And so our main focus in Japan was a little bit different than in the Philippines. Instead of doing a lot of like preaching and sermon giving, Japanese culture, you don't just like start going up to them and initiating an evangelism. They kind of have to come to you. So we did a lot of like free hugs and prayer ministry. Next slide, please. And so we partnered with YWAM Tokyo. And I even met Ben. Ben was someone from YWAM Los Angeles that I went on my first missions trip with, and I got to see him again in Japan. So next slide, please. And we had times of worship at parks. We went to the YWAM Yokohama base, and we even met this group of Double Dutch. They were a part of a university club, and they were just on the streets. And we got to evangelize to them, and even some of them, I still have their Instagram and contact information. And from that little interaction, they're like, "Oh, you're American? Like, what's about American culture?" And we're like, "Oh, yeah." And we invited them to our kind of English and coffee shop event. And then we worship in Japanese. Next slide. And so one of the main things that I really loved to do was a lot of like drawing little pictures and notes and then handing them out. So I made all of these, and I wrote a little message in Japanese, and I gave them to little children I met at the park. And actually, this 2 group of girls, they stayed a little bit longer, and they actually heard us worship and hear from the Lord, so a seed was planted there. Next slide, please. And so then we also did a lot of prayer walks at Asakusa Temple. Over here in this picture is that they were trying to get spiritually cleansed, so they drink the water at this well to hopefully be spiritually cleansed. But we know that Jesus has done the work, that he has finished the work, and that we are cleansed through him. And so, yeah, just breaking and praying for any strongholds in the area. Next slide. And so, yeah, thank you for supporting me from this experience and from going on DTS and all on these outreach phases. I heard the Lord speak to me while I was on outreach, and while I was in the Philippines, our host family had a refrigerator, and on there was the word Paris and Thailand, and so on their magnets. And so I was like, oh, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll hear more about it. And then I heard about this group from circuit riders from my DTS during my lecture phase. And then from there, while I was in Japan, there was a guy standing right next to us on the subway, and he was wearing YWAM Los Angeles Jesus Loves Paris shirt. And so then I ended up going to Paris as well. And so I went to the Paris Olympics to evangelize, and we spent the first 3 days also repenting, learning about the gospel, and just being trained. And so next slide. I wanted to share about both experiences, because if it wasn't for the DTS and what had happened of me coming up on stage, speaking in front of people, I would have never done this. I wouldn't have had the faith to hey, God, I trust you with my finances. God, I trust you with where I'm going. I'm going on a solo trip by myself. And so the first picture, it's kind of hard to see, but I went up on stage. The first day, they're like, hey, I need someone to go on stage to share the gospel, and they just called me out, and I went up there, I shared the gospel in front of them, and that's how everyone was kind of introduced to me, was preaching the gospel in front of everyone. And then the other two pictures, it's not playing the video, but we went around and we just, without any instruments, went around the streets, the subways, and we just started singing worship songs to Jesus on the streets with a group of like 40 of us. And we did it in front of like the Eiffel Tower and in front of like the Notre Dame, and we just walked through the streets. We helped the homeless, and so it was really cool to just like be fully sold out for him and to live boldly for him, because the fear of man, the fear of rejection, the things that, fear of offending people, I was so scared to do about talking in my faith. And to be able to step out and just worship, dance, sing, and preach on the streets was an amazing experience too. So next slide, please. And so, can't see from the video, but in one day, I just stood up on a street, on a corner, and I just stood up and I shared the gospel to over 100 people. I just stood up on a table, and people were walking by, and I didn't care what I looked like, what I sound like. I just wanted to show that I loved people, and I wanted them to know the truth. And so it was, how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? How can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? How can they hear without someone preaching to them? How can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Romans 10:14-15. And for me, I was like, I have a lot of friends that know that I'm Christian and know that I do good things, but unless I tell them, like with words, that I'm preaching to them and telling them about Jesus, how do they know? And they only know me as a good person. And so I wanted to truly live out my faith and say, God, I'm putting my head on the chopping block, and I want to live fully sold out for you. Next slide. And so all the glory goes to God. Revival started to happen in Paris too. And so there's 24-hour prayers. Throughout history, any revival that ever happened started from prayer. And that usually it was people that were willing to surrender their full hearts and their full selves to God. And that revival was happening. So on my last day of when I was there, this is what the statistic was. So 3,571 were able to hear the gospel, 255 received salvation, 101 received healing, 2,824 were prayed for, 23,333 received Bible tracts, 2,693 heard the testimonies, 2,000 or so received acts of compassion or mercy ministries, and then 107 were referred to local churches. And so I really, really, truly believe like this was the time that I really saw how the Holy Spirit moved, and that I was seeing someone who couldn't walk and who was in a wheelchair was now being healed. And I was seeing how just people from all over the world were coming in and were like, who's Jesus? And we got to share our testimonies with them. And so I just wanted to show like all the glory goes to God in this season. There's a lot more stories that did happen, and I wanted to keep it a little bit brief, but that really the main thing that I wanted to share is obedience and surrender. And that surrender is the best way to live our life. If we surrender to the Lord, if we come with him with our full hearts, even if we messed up, that God is the same God who is with me in this season of my life as he is now, in the harder seasons of my life and in the best seasons of my life, that God deserves all the glory, that his goodness, that his faithfulness never changed. And so, thank you.